Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, a production of WDIW Media, hosted by Joseph Pazar and inspired by David Michael Slater's book, We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them. So before I bring you today's episode, just a quick note about programming. Our schedule is likely to become a bit more irregular for a few weeks, so definitely subscribing via email to the website or subscribing to the podcast through any of our major distribution channels such as iTunes Podcasts or Google Play is the best way to make sure you stay updated with new content. But our school year has started and I'm teaching new courses this year. And I don't think I need to explain too much because if you're a teacher, you know what it's like to teach a new course or grade level. So I'm going to be spending just a bit more time and focus on getting that off the ground in a meaningful way. Our upcoming episodes are going to be, I think, pretty awesome. We have some high-profile guests scheduled to come on the podcast here, do some recording again at the end of this month, and so new episodes to come, but maybe with a brief interlude. Today's conversation was with John Larmer, and he is the editor-in-chief at the Buck Institute for Education. I have to say, I learned quite a bit during our conversation, and I was a little bit selfish in that I focused the conversation pretty extensively on teaching math, and I'm a math teacher. So I promise in the future to ask more questions surrounding other subjects, because contrary to my natural inclination, there are other subjects other than mathematics to worry about. So it was a real pleasure to speak with John, and he again, is the editor-in-chief at the Buck Institute, and he has been director of product and development and associate director since joining in 2001. He writes and edits the Buck Institute's PBL blog and other website content. He co-authored and or edited BIE's project-based curriculum units for high school government and economics, the project-based learning handbook, and the books in BIE's PBL toolkit series. So there's the PBL starter kit for elementary grades. There's the starter kit for middle and high school. There's also the PBL for 21st Century Success book. And these are all great resources. Prior to joining BIE, John was a senior program associate at Wested, where he was a consultant to middle schools and high schools in the use of standards and assessments. For 10 years, John taught high school social studies and English. He co-founded a restructured small high school and was a school coach for the Coalition of Essential Schools and a member of its National School Reform faculty. He is passionate about the need to change our education system to make school more engaging and meaningful for students and more rewarding for teachers. John received a master's in educational technology and in educational administration from San Francisco State University and earned a BA in political science from Stanford University. Outside of work, he enjoys spending time with his family, hiking, cooking, rock concerts, reading about politics, and backpacking in the High Sierra. So again, I thoroughly enjoyed talking with John, and I hope you find our conversation valuable. And without further ado, I bring you John Larmer. And I am here with John Larmer. John, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hi, nice to be here, Joe.
Well, I'm really happy to speak with you. You are part of the Buck Institute. In fact, you're the editor-in-chief, and the work of the Buck Institute has just permeated my little world in education. I worked for the Gifted and Talented Department for a few years here in Northern Nevada, and we had a large focus on project-based learning, and I was constantly impressed with the materials and the work that you guys have done. So it's a real privilege to speak with you, and I'm wondering if you can let our listeners know how you came to be the editor-in-chief at the Buck Institute. What is your educational story?
I came to the Buck Institute in 2001. And before that, I worked at Wested briefly in San Francisco, the Federal Research Lab, consulting with schools and districts on the use of standards and assessment data to improve instruction. Before that, though, I was a teacher at Oceana High School, which is a restructured high school that had a lot of new features like team teaching and interdisciplinary curriculum, project-based learning. The staff had keys to the building and made a lot of decisions as a whole instead of the principal being the boss. It was a very interesting school. And we joined the Coalition of Essential Schools, that national school reform network founded by Ted Sizer, whose ideas continue to inform my work and the work of a lot of people in the progressive education world. And so anyway, when I was teaching there, I became aware of the Buck Institute's work. And when I left West Ed in 2000, the Buck Institute needed someone who could help develop curriculum units for high school government. They were problem-based curriculum for high school government, which I had taught. So I helped develop some of those units and edited our project-based economics curriculum materials. And we switched from calling them problem-based to project-based, midway through that, I should say. And then we began to focus our work entirely on project-based learning and helping teachers in schools design their own projects. We didn't create the projects for them, but K through 12, any subject, we help teachers design their own projects and manage them well in the classroom. So demand for that sort of slowly increased, and suddenly around 2012, it really increased. And that's when I became editor-in-chief. We began to specialize more in our jobs and grow in number of staff. Before that, I was doing a lot of workshops and materials for workshops. And now I focus mostly on our blog and writing books and other written materials about project-based learning.
Yeah, and I discovered your blog a while back, and it's a lot of authors on there. It's a wonderful resource. So I'll definitely put a link for that in our episode description. And I'm wondering, with your time at West Ed, and then you just have such an interesting experience in education, kind of from the research consulting side, the on-the-ground classroom side, and now the project-based learning side. I'm wondering if you can speak to how research kind of up in the ivory tower at an organization such as West Ed informs the coaching and informs practice. Is there currently a disconnect, or do you think overall our system's functioning pretty well and getting new ideas down to the ground level in the classrooms of teachers?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's always been a problem with getting research on the ground level with teachers. I think that still, by and large, is true about the research world. I'm not a researcher myself. I'm not a PhD. I have looked at a lot of research, and I've written about what I've seen from a practitioner's point of view. I try and help translate research for practicing teachers, actually. So there is still a disconnect, but researchers are very aware of the disconnect. So I think, they've tried, and gradually, things change, and there are more and more practical studies over the years. And we're seeing that with project-based learning. There's been more practical studies of PBL in recent years, and a lot more graduate students are focusing on it for their master's thesis, for example, or PhD candidates doing research about it. And most of that you're seeing about project-based learning is more practical for teachers.
Yeah, it translates kind of directly into the thought process of planning curriculum. I wonder if you mentioned you had planned some sort of civic, I think you had mentioned, or government projects for high schools. And I'm wondering if you see a special opportunity here in the last year, because I couldn't just help but connect that to what's going on with March for Our Lives and some of the student movements to get students registered to vote. Do you see this as kind of a special time with regards to project-based learning in civics?
Yeah, I think now more than ever is a good time for projects that get students out solving real-world problems and taking civic action, because there is so much of that in the news today. I mean, that's always been true. There's always been issues that students could address. But now it seems like there's much more energy at the grassroots level for addressing our problems, partially because the government is kind of stuck and isn't able to address them, our nation's and the world's problems through legislation. So citizen action, I think, has become more prominent, and that's a great way to get students engaged in project-based learning. I mean, teenagers are hungry to make an impact on their world and make a difference and feel like they have a sense of their own power. Yeah, so things like March for Our Lives, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, a lot of these new movements you're seeing in the last couple of years really do lend themselves to good project-based learning. And I've heard of more and more civic engagement projects at the local level too, where students are tackling issues that aren't maybe national organization related, but they're issues in their own communities. And those are always those kind of really super authentic projects that are meaningful, where students are working with local organizations or connecting with national organizations to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves. That's so motivating, and kids are so motivated to learn. I mean, what great civics lessons, instead of just learning about the government, they're learning how to influence the government. And you can learn the same content basically, but by doing it with project-based learning and civic engagement, you're learning it in a much deeper way, and it'll stay with you longer, and you care about the issues, you get a sense of your own power. A lot of kids, especially who don't have a sense of power, those who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, when they do projects that do give them power, it can be a game changer in their lives.
So I wonder, of the 8 major components of project-based learning, as you guys define it, are there certain components that present a larger challenge to teachers kind of out of the gate? And are there certain areas of project-based learning that seem more natural? And I guess it would be more, maybe there's research behind that, but I also wonder, just in your anecdotal experience, if you've noticed differences on those components.
Yeah, it's pretty easy for teachers to think of ideas for projects. The hard part, I think, is sustaining the inquiry. They aren't used to teaching in an inquiry-based way. They're used to, giving students the answers, or having short-term assignments where kids just look stuff up and find the answers to closed-ended questions. So the open-ended questions, the driving questions you see in project-based learning, that's new for a lot of teachers. And coaching students over a period of time, 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks on a project to do inquiry, to not just look stuff up on the web and copy it, but to actually think about what kind of questions they should ask, where can they find information, not just on the web, but maybe it's local experts or people in their community they're going to talk to for answers to their questions. And then digging deeper, having a new round with deeper questions, kind of a spiraling effect. That's unusual for teachers to manage, and it takes a little bit of practice. At the beginning, that can be tricky for teachers. Another aspect that can be tricky is assessment. And it's one of our project-based teaching practices called assessing student learning, because a lot of people think that project-based learning means you give up all traditional assessment. It's all about performance-based assessment. And that's true to only some extent. You can still have regular content-based quizzes and tests during a project, if that's the best way to measure whether students are learning the content. But you also would have some performance-based measures, rubrics about making a presentation or collaboration or critical thinking, or how this concept is reflected in the product you've created for the project. So that kind of assessment can be a little tricky for teachers, but they should rest assured that they don't have to totally reinvent their assessment practices. It's just in different contexts during a project. Another area that sometimes people find challenging is the authenticity and public product angle, because that's another part where teachers are not used to doing that. They give assignments in school, students turn their work in to their teacher. The teacher is the audience for the student's work. Or maybe it's your classmates if you're giving a presentation, or your writing maybe is shared among the class, your peers. But to find a real authentic public audience, somebody outside the classroom and not just parents, that's not bad, and other people at the school, that counts as public, but really going out beyond the school to find real world people, adults in professions and different organizations, online audiences, that makes it really meaningful for students and ups the quality of their work because they're more motivated. And so finding those outside connections can be challenging for teachers. It's a little extra layer of work. You got to sort of mind your contact list and think of who works in different fields, or who in your community you could contact. Maybe you tap your parents or other staff members or your friends for their connections. So that's an extra layer of work sometimes, but it really helps improve the quality of the project. And that, I mentioned authenticity, it connects very much to the product, obviously, but the other aspect of authenticity is making it connect to students' lives. So that's an area where, especially high school teachers and middle school to some extent perhaps, don't always know their students that well because they have so many of them. The average high school teacher sees 150 kids a day going through their classroom in 50-minute periods. So it's hard to know your kids well, but it's really key to making projects meaningful for them. Is what are their interests, what's going on in their lives, their culture, their identity. It could be things about their future, jobs and career interests, and real world problems of community, but also projects that are really authentic and really connects to students in a personal way too. And that requires knowing your students. And that can be a new challenge for some teachers. Some teachers love it and they already do that. But I'm thinking of a lot of high school teachers I knew who preferred sort of staying behind the lectern and giving their lecture and their PowerPoint slides and didn't always connect to the kids as individuals. And part of that is the structure. You can't when there's 150 kids a day. So I think high schools need to think about their use of time and what their student teacher ratio is. And that requires a lot of structural change that goes beyond PBL. But I think high schools need to think about that.
I was thinking about authenticity prior to our conversation here, and I'm wondering if you would agree with this thought, and if so, maybe help explain it. And maybe I'm just wrong, but out of all the components, I felt like you could probably get some of those other components outside of a true project-based learning curriculum, but it's that deep authenticity, I feel like in my teachings only come about through a project. I've had driving questions, I've had kind of an inquiry model, and a lot of the other components outside of PBL, but I've never really achieved that level of authenticity where the work actually mattered for some reason outside of the arbitrary, here's this requirement, here's this hoop, jump through it and learn something. And I'm wondering if you'd agree with that. And if that's true, why is authenticity so hard beyond the structural challenges? Why is it so hard to connect our content to students' lives all the time?
Yeah, authenticity is challenging. It's a different way of thinking for a lot of teachers. It's not just about, this novel in the English class, or this procedure in a math class, or this concept in science. It's how does it connect to the real world? So a lot of teachers, first of all, we're not taught that way. So they themselves were probably either they're really good at school, they're good at the, playing the game of school and memorizing information and spitting it back on tests. Some of them maybe were not good in school and wanted to teach differently. So they might be the ones actually who would gravitate toward project-based learning. But with authenticity, it's a challenge because a lot of subjects don't obviously connect to real world things. I mean, some do, like, civics obviously connects to things happening in the world. Economics, that's science, you can find real world phenomenon that are pretty easy to connect. But in subjects like math, for example, it's hard to think of how math always connects to a real world situation. So we even give math teachers a little break and say, you don't have to do as many projects in math as you might in a science or social studies class. And perhaps the projects aren't quite as fancy, all the bells and whistles with a fancy product and a presentation at the end. They're a little more contained, a little more problem solving oriented than perhaps a fully interdisciplinary, out in the real world kind of project. I mean, those are great if you can do them. And some math teachers are great at inventing those kind of projects. But doing a couple of good math projects a year is probably enough for math teachers. So it's often hard. Same is true for early world languages, like Spanish 1, French 1 classes. They don't know enough of the language yet to do a lot with it in a project. But even there, you can think of some projects. You wouldn't teach the whole course, perhaps, using projects, but you could sprinkle in a couple of projects each semester where they're applying their knowledge. For example, I heard one in Spanish the other day where kids were just making signage with very simple words for Spanish-speaking people in their community and placing the signs around the community. So just little directional signs and informational signs. And that can be done even in a Spanish 1 class.
I'm a math teacher, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, is there an extra challenge for math? And I think you kind of answered that, because I have noticed there are certain subject material within a math course that is pretty difficult, and the best I've been able to do is just try to make it as interesting as possible with using maybe some techniques from people like Dan Meyer or something. So it's interesting to hear you say that, but but no, keep going. I guess I'm just responding and maybe feeling a little bit like, oh, okay, so my feeling of frustration there is founded.
Yeah, it is frustrating for math teachers sometimes when they hear about all these fancy projects that involve real world experts and kids creating these amazing products and making presentations to their community. And math can sometimes feel like they're sort of tagging along, like they help the kids do the calculations for the social studies project.
Exactly.
Kind of like the way English teachers sometimes feel like they're tagging along. They help the kids with the written report for the science project that's going to the city council in their town. So there is some of that true of English and math teachers feeling like they're tagging along to interdisciplinary projects. So for them, we say, well, think of a project that's based in your subject area, and it'll probably connect in some way to some other subject. Like there's going to be some reading or writing or speaking and listening in almost any project. So even a math anchored project is going to have some ELA components to it. Um, so so yeah, there's room for lots of different kinds of projects, and some of them can be more like simulations or almost like case studies. That's true in math. You see that often. It's often they're called problem-based. Problem-based learning is used in math a lot, which is kind of the other side of the coin of project-based learning. It's where a problem might be presented more as a case study or a fictitious scenario, like solving, what happened at this auto accident. You're like a crime scene investigator kind of thing, where you got this data about the skid marks and the speed at which cars were traveling, and you got to figure out who was at fault. So there's a real world application of math there, but it's not like you're actually out there solving this real thing in your local community streets. But so those kind of simulations and case studies can work better for math. Also, interestingly, for history, those kind of project ideas can work better because history works now for current history, contemporary issues where you can talk to people in your community or people who are veterans of Vietnam or people who remember the 1960s. You can talk to them and create history projects based on that. But when you get back to distant history, like the French Revolution or the Renaissance or Rome and Greece, you may have to do more like simulations of situations at the time that required people to solve a problem, or you might simulate, a mock trial of Harry Truman dropping the bomb in World War II. So it's not like you're actually pursuing some contemporary issue, but you're recreating an issue in the past through a simulated mock trial. I kind of wandered around there. I don't know if I got your original question about authenticity answered.
Oh no, yeah, I think you did that, and it led us to a wonderful place, because I was just thinking as you were talking that it sounds as though you can still have some form of PBL that's very valuable that may not have all 8 components. So like in math, you may not have that true layer of authentic application. So it's a kind of a made up situation. But other than that, it's pretty much a project-based learning material. And same that reference example you cite for civics. I find that very helpful because it seems so much more doable, because there's a few areas in math that I think we can double down on because they lend themselves so well to such projects.
Right. Like exponential growth, I've heard, is a good one for doing projects, or obviously probability and statistics. You can see lots of real world connections for that. Yeah, when it comes to the 8 essential elements of good project design, we talk about dialing them up or down. And I think any project should have all 8 elements, but you can dial them down quite a bit. So the public product in a math project might not be, like I said, some fancy thing students have created and are showing to their community. It might just be a solution to a problem they are explaining to their classmates, and perhaps a few other people are in the audience besides their classmates. So you can we call it a dimmer switch approach. So I think all 8 elements should be present to some extent in every project, but some can be turned down and some can be turned up according to the subject, the teacher's experience level, the students themselves, their interests and their experience with project-based learning. So it doesn't have to be, all the way turned up to 11 every time for every element to be good quality project-based learning.
So I'm curious, in your experience, what kind of teacher does it take to get really good at this sort of work, beyond just willingness to try it? What are the dispositions of folks that really do well with this?
The kind of teachers who do well at project-based learning are those who really want to engage with their students. And that's important. And as I said before, I know some high school teachers who aren't perhaps that interested in engaging with kids in a more personal level. They're more interested in their subject area and extolling about history or explaining math at the board in the front of the room. And there's a place for that kind of instruction in a project, but you can't do that all the time in project-based learning, obviously. You've also got to engage with your kids, coach them as they're working, as they're doing inquiry, as they're developing their products. So it takes a certain kind of engagement, a desire to engage with kids to be a good project-based learning teacher. We're finding that there's a certain percentage of teachers in schools who are the early adopters, who can do project-based learning without even reading our books or taking our workshops or going to our conference events. They can just do it naturally. That's sort of the naturals. There may be less than 5% of teachers out there. There's a lot more who are sort of the early majority of teachers, I think, who could do project-based learning, but just need a little help, a little bit of professional development, some instructional coaching, some peer collaboration to help design projects. So not all teachers can design projects, we're finding. It takes a certain amount of creativity. That's why working in teams of teachers really helps to create their own projects, grade level teams or subject area teams or cross-disciplinary teams for those multi-subject projects. So having a mix of ideas among the teachers as they're creating a project really helps. And it also takes teachers who are willing to take a risk and let go of some control. So some teachers, perhaps in the past, in traditional instruction, are very used to managing every single moment in the classroom. And they may have been taught that. And the direct instruction approach is, okay, you're on minute 3 of day 3 of this lesson or this unit. So you should be here in this book. You should say this, and you should have the students do that and collect the work and give them this feedback. It's all very regimented. So if teachers are used to that, making the shift to project-based learning where you have to let go of control a bit because students might take a project in different directions than you expected. They're given some voice and choice. That's one of our essential elements. And you have to allow for that as a project-based teacher. And it's okay when you're starting to have a more structured project. We always give teachers that reassurance that you don't have to give up complete control. You're still directing the project. You've still designed a lot of the project. You kind of know where it's going to be heading. You don't have it totally open-ended where students can create any kind of product they want. You might say, we're creating a video for this project. And that's okay, especially when you're starting out to sort of have more structured projects. So as teachers get used to it, though, they realize that they can give up some control. They can trust in their students, trust the process, and it starts to work. And it may be rough for the first couple of projects. You might feel like the middle of it, we call it the messy middle. There's a lot of chaos in the classroom and it's noisy and people walk by and wonder what the heck's going on in there. But it should be a controlled chaos, right? So students may be noisy because they're talking in their teams about how to get their product, how to improve the quality of their product, or what this driving questions answer might be, or what this research told them about this aspect of the project. So it should be a noisy but focused sort of buzz in the classroom. We talk a lot about building the culture. That's a thing that a lot of teachers need to think about, because the culture in a classroom based on direct instruction is, kids sitting in rows, quietly absorbing information from the teacher, doing the assignment, taking the test, showing they've memorized the information. So in project-based learning, it's a whole different paradigm, really. It's about students constructing their own understanding of the knowledge and the skills and the concepts they're supposed to learn. They build that understanding through engaging with the content. They are making a lot of their own choices about what resources to use or what kind of research they're gonna do and what to make of it. So it's a different way of learning. For a lot of teachers, I think that's a problem. They don't quite see that project-based learning is based on that different kind of approach about what students should learn and how they should learn it. So it's not about covering a lot of content. It's not about getting through 500 years of European history or this entire textbook in Algebra 1 or all the different science units you normally might teach through a bunch of lectures and PowerPoints and occasional labs. So you have to give up the idea that you can cover as much content, and that's tough for teachers. That bumps up against the assessment system, the tests that teachers are held accountable for, and that's a whole nother topic. But the idea that you can let go of some of the control, let go of some of the need to cover content, and allow students to sort of make their own meaning as they're learning in the project, which motivates them and makes them remember it longer, by the way, for that test. That is a big, crucial leap for a teacher to make to become a real project-based learning teacher.
What are the structural barriers? Like if you could remove one major structural barrier or two, would you remove first off?
Well, the number one thing, we hear two things, two barriers to project-based learning. One is the test, the standardized test that we're held accountable for. And there's some myths around that. And the other is lack of time. So testing and time are the two big barriers. When it comes to tests, teachers are kind of told, and with some reason for this belief, that you need to just cover it all because it might be on the test, and you hope students will remember it if that item pops up on the test. And they've done analyses and they kind of know certain items are going to be seen on the test more often, and they spend more time on those units in their courses. But it's sort of a myth that just by pouring a bunch of stuff into students' heads, they're going to remember it for the test. And the research shows that when project-based learning is done well, and that's important, done well, which means aligned to the content standards, it's rigorous, there's assessment built into the projects. When it's done well, it does no harm and even can improve test scores. And that's been shown in a couple different studies recently. There have been a couple good ones on middle school science. And those projects, I should say, were designed by outside organization and implemented by the teachers. There are fewer studies of teacher design projects because those are harder to pin down for researchers. It's always been a tricky thing to pin down because design quality is very uneven. There are different models for project-based learning, different definitions of it. And so it's very hard for researchers to sort of, study implementation of project-based learning because it varies so much in its natural state. But the research shows that when projects are designed well and teachers are trained on how to implement those projects, that results on regular old standardized tests do go up. Test scores go up. Not to mention student motivation. Students build skills in critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, all those 21st century success skills, along with remembering content knowledge longer. So testing is one barrier. So if districts, for example, can remove some of those hurdles, like those benchmark assessments that teachers have to hit every 3 weeks or every 6 weeks in their course, or provide some flexibility at least, so you don't have to follow the script. You can't follow a script and do project-based learning. So districts and schools had to think about that, their testing and assessment system, and sort of rest assured that your test scores will not drop if you do project-based learning. And the other thing is time. Most teachers do not have enough time to plan curriculum. If they're just being given a curriculum off the shelf, they just deliver it like a set of lectures and worksheets and a textbook questions to march through. That you can sort of do with minimal planning and deliver it in a normal school week. But to invent projects and to reflect on them with your colleagues and to make the arrangements for projects, it takes more planning, at least up front. Once the project is running, it feels kind of more relaxed because it's going. You don't have as many sort of daily lessons to crank out because kids are working on their project. So it can feel more relaxed when you're actually in the project. But the beginning of the project, before it starts, you've got to do a lot of upfront planning. So lack of time is a problem because teachers' school days are not structured for enough planning. There's a prep period here and there or a lunch period here and there. So schools that do PBL well find ways to create more time. They might have a shortened school day on a Wednesday. They might have flexible schedules where they bring in subs to help teachers get planning time, or kids are doing other activities while their core teachers are off planning a project. You have some breaks during the school year between quarters or semesters where teachers can rethink their projects, reflect on how they went, plan new ones, or fine-tune ones they want to repeat from the previous year. And summer planning time, if teachers can if schools and districts can find a way to pay teachers, hopefully pay them for summertime for planning, and of course professional development, that's a big thing too. So and it's especially true for high school teachers, to a lesser extent for middle school. As I said before, those 150 kids per day running through your classroom at 50 minutes a clip. The problem there, the time of the schedule is a problem too. You can't have a 45-minute period 7 days a week, 5 days a week, 7 periods a day, does not lend itself to project-based learning. Block schedules, longer, more flexible blocks of time are really necessary. So testing and time, those are the barriers, but schools are finding ways to make it work. More and more the districts we work with are finding ways around those barriers.
You brought up the quality of a PBL, because I can imagine, some folks, they sort of check the box on the 8 components. And of course, I've done this. I think this is part of the learning curve, but for whatever reason, it's not necessarily the highest of quality project-based learning. I know I've definitely experienced that myself as I've gone down this journey. And recently, I noticed you launched a new framework, and it's basically high-quality PBL. So I'm wondering if, what was the reasoning or the need to basically say, hey, here's what high-quality PBL looks like? Is that due to the popularity of PBL and the fact that as more people implement it, the core definition of what it is has kind of been diluted? I'm wondering if you could speak to that framework and why it was launched.
Yes, we are worried that with PBL becoming suddenly so popular, it could be one of those education trends that everybody jumps on the bandwagon and then it doesn't pay off. It doesn't live up to its promises because it's not being done well. And you're seeing that a lot with commercial curriculum providers and publishers providing things that are project-based units or project-based lessons, and they're not really very rigorous. They're what we call dessert projects, where kids are basically taught most of the content traditionally, then do this fun activity on the side, or after the main learning has been done in the unit, you assign a dessert project, or maybe it's a side dish where kids go off at home and build their model of the pyramid, or they do their research on a famous mathematician or an inventor and make a little presentation and a poster for the class. Those are side dishes and dessert projects. They're worthwhile for some purposes, but they aren't really project-based learning. So yes, we're worried about PBL becoming almost too popular, or popular and then declining in its quality. And our gold standard PBL model was our first answer to that problem. And so that helps teachers design good projects. And our gold standard model's teaching practices help teachers think about what they do during a project to make it good quality. But we decided that there was also a need for a more international standard. It wasn't the Buck Institute's standard, but a standard for good quality project-based learning, just say high quality project-based learning, that is shared by many different organizations. And the steering committee, which is composed of several different organizations, we were a facilitator, but it wasn't just us. The steering committee decided to write the HQ PBL framework, as it's called, high quality PBL framework, from the point of view of the student experience. So it kind of adds to people's thinking. Our model, for example, or a new text model, are more about how teachers design projects. But the HQ PBL framework describes 6 criteria that students should experience when they're in a good project. So it dovetails very well with our work and others like the New Tech Network that helped create this, and High Tech High and Envision Learning, EL Education, Big Picture Schools, a lot of the schools in the Deeper Learning Network, as well as other researchers and practitioners on the steering committee. And there are even some people from other countries too, Finland and Taiwan and I forget where else. So it was really an attempt, kind of like the ISTE standards, to establish an international framework for high quality project-based learning. So anybody who's doing PBL can look at those standards and see if they measure up. And it may go to the point, right now, the HQPBL side just has the criteria and some examples and some videos to show what HQPBL is. It may get to the point where people are actually able to sort of put the seal of approval on their work, like the old Good Housekeeping seal of approval, like this curriculum is high quality PBL. Our school does high quality PBL. You know, we subscribe to these standards for HQPBL in our work.
So I'm wondering for like the best online location for teachers to go. Let's say teachers teaching. Let's choose math because we talked about that being a harder subject. So Algebra 1. Is there a website with fully formed projects for that course that have been sort of vetted through that framework yet, or is that something that's in the works?
Right now, finding projects for different subjects is sort of a catch as catch can approach. There are lots of things on the web you could find. If you just Google, project-based learning, Algebra 1, you'll get some stuff. The trick is it high quality? So we have on our website, we have a project search tool with a few hundred projects, and you can sort through them by subject and grade level. And we've curated those. So those are pretty good. They aren't all designed by us though. So they don't all look alike. They're different formats. Some have more detail than others. That's a good place to start. And then other organizations like EL Education and High Tech High and Envision Learning, those organizations all have project libraries on their websites that are good to check out. We are developing more projects of our own, which we're going to be releasing along with an online learning platform in early 2019. So we're creating projects in different subjects and grade levels, K through 12, and there will definitely be one for Algebra 1 in there. I should say one to start. There needs to be many eventually. We hope to collect and create a lot more over the years. So yeah, that is a big area of need. There are a couple of websites also. You mentioned Dan Meyer's work. I love his real world applications of math. And one of his associates created a place called mathalicious.com. Have you seen those? They're really good, sort of mini projects.
Yeah, and I guess that explains I think I came into this conversation with a little misconception because I've done some of that stuff and it's just been wonderful, but I was thinking, this isn't really PBL. But I think your comments on kind of the dials really helped me out with that.
Right. Yeah. The Math projects, they're very real world and they're super engaging, but they're fairly short. They don't have they're more like a simulation than an actual let's make a real world impact kind of project. And they don't usually have much of a public presentation of students' work at the end. So it's a little more of a self-contained, but I call them a mini project, but they're good stuff. They're very engaging and they're definitely rigorous on the mathematics.
Thanks. I think I'm going to put as many links for those things as I can find for our listeners, because I think that is also a barrier, as you mentioned, the time. So if a teacher could find, a curated, high quality, vetted Algebra 1 project, I think that would just be huge. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so I'm excited for that launch, it sounds like.
Yeah, that launch is going to be exciting too. Because we've noticed that we do these PBL 101 workshops all over the country, and they're very successful, and people love them and say it's the best PD they ever had. But then they get back to their school, maybe it's a few months later, and are they really going to finish planning that project they started in our workshop, and are they actually going to implement it? And it doesn't always happen. So we think there needs to be a lot more follow-up. And we know this about good professional development. There has to be follow-up, and it has to be ongoing and job embedded, and have some coaching for a period of years afterwards. So it starts with our workshop, but then we can continue the coaching virtually, doing courses on specific subjects within project-based learning, like how to write a better driving question, or how to assess critical thinking, or lots of different topics we could have little mini courses about, as well as this expanded project library. Because you're right, a lot of teachers, it's a barrier that they don't have the time, or perhaps the inclination, and maybe even the skill sometimes to plan a great project. But if they can find one they can adapt for their students in their classroom, it's already existing out there, it's been vetted, it's been tried by other teachers, that's a great way to jumpstart your PBL practice. And we think for a lot of teachers in that sort of the late majority group, the other big half of the teaching profession that will adopt something if it's easy enough, if it's been proven, if their colleagues are doing it, they'll jump on the bandwagon too. Those kind of pre-designed projects are a great way to jumpstart those teachers' practice. And then once you get the hang of it after a couple of years, then you start to develop your own ideas for projects. It becomes more of a natural way to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like a way of thinking about teaching. I'm wondering about this idea. I think it was a headline on your blog, but it was written by somebody else whose name I now can't recall, but it was something like PBL isn't just for GT. And that struck me when I came across it, because my first introduction to project-based learning, really in its I would say its best form, which would be basically the work from the Buck Institute, only occurred once I was employed by a gifted and talented education department. And I've since, taken that knowledge with me. But I'm wondering if that's just me as a, anecdotally, connecting the dots there, or if there really is this situation where PBL is being used more so only in GT programs. I'm wondering two things. Is that something you also see? So is that possibly true? And if so, why?
Yeah, we have seen project-based learning and problem-based learning crop up more in the gifted and talented world, or at least originally it was there, because it was seen as sort of an enrichment. It wasn't the basic way to teach content. It was seen as something once students have the basic skills, reading, writing, math, then they can go on and do this really cool stuff, real world projects and community-based projects. And so it was sort of held for students who had a certain level of skill. Or you might have seen it perhaps in, some private schools or in high income suburban schools where they weren't worried so much about their test scores and whether kids could do the basics, and they felt they had the room to do project-based learning. So yes, the problem is that some people believe that project-based learning is not for all students, but we really think it is. And that's part of our work. One of our strategic goals is to push on the educational equity agenda. And we think that project-based learning can be a force for equity. It can really transform the lives of kids who haven't maybe had a chance to make an impact on their world in their lives. And it does not need to be reserved for kids who can read at a certain level. You don't give up your literacy program entirely when you do PBL. You still teach kids to read, but you also do project-based learning in the afternoon. In the morning is literacy and math, and then you have projects in the afternoon. And hopefully they link back to what you're reading and have some real-world math applications. But it's a myth that PBL should be reserved only for some students. That's true of English learners too. Project-based learning is a great way to get English learners to, talking with their peers, talking with real-world experts, you talking about real-world context for what they're learning. It's great for English learners. It's so motivating for kids. A lot of kids, one parent I know said her second grader didn't like to read very much until he got into project-based learning. Then he was so motivated to read by this engaging project he was involved in, that his reading skills went up. So you may not use project-based learning to teach all the basic skills, but it's a great way to apply them and motivate kids to want to learn and use the math and figure out the history of their community when they're doing a podcast that's going to be shown in their local or made available in their local library. So it's a great way to motivate all kids. And it's a myth that you sort of have to teach the basics first, and then the very end of the year, say, or the end of the semester, you finally do a project. You can't do all your content perhaps through projects, but don't just save them for the end of the year when kids have reached a certain level, and certainly don't save them just for certain kids, because all kids deserve it. And it really can transform the lives of kids who are furthest from opportunity. Somebody who's feel like they don't have much power in the world, they are just told, sit still, be quiet, memorize this stuff, go through this reading curriculum over and over again, retake the math class you failed twice. That's just a recipe for dropouts and burnout for teachers. And with engaging project-based learning that's designed well, students are going to be learning, teachers are more energized, students will stay in school. There's research to show that too, that schools that do project-based learning, among other things, like reduce their size and care more for their kids, the kids graduate at higher rates. Kids who who were the first in their family to go to college, they attend college at higher rates. They persist in college at higher rates than kids from regular programs. So PBL can really help close the equity gap for a lot of kids.
You make me think of the benefits of self-regulation. I think I just probably in the last year and a half came across Richard Cash's book on student self-regulation, again in the GT world. But that's something I noticed, and I'm wondering if you could comment on this. What kind of benefits do you see for building self-regulation among students in all the avenues and all the domains that we care about through PBL? Does it just kind of come along for the ride, or do you have to intentionally be aware of it during PBL?
That's a good question. We do talk a lot about self-management and project management skills being something that can be learned well through project-based learning. So it's not just a byproduct. Any of those success skills, as we call them, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, creativity and innovation, and self-management and project management, all those sort of success skills that are so necessary for today's world have to be taught, as well as they have to be taught intentionally. They can't just be sort of assumed that students are learning that in the course of doing a project. So a lot of our material does talk about how to explicitly scaffold that kind of thinking, or those processes for managing your time or persisting through a difficult challenge in a project. And teachers can help students by providing the scaffolding, by having them reflect on how they're doing and pause during projects to reflect on challenges and how you're overcoming them. Challenges in your team, challenges in your thinking, problems you've got to solve, problems in finding resources. So a lot of it teaches students, I'm not sure I like the word grit, but the idea of persistence, resilience, managing, you sort of fighting your way through challenges till you reach a conclusion, till you reach a successful outcome with your project. What a great feeling for a kid who's had a tricky project with this deadline coming up, with a public presentation, and they do it, and it's great, and people see their work in public. It's so rewarding for kids. So intentionally scaffolding those kind of skills is important. And one of the high quality PBL frameworks criteria is project management. And that is sort of risen up in our thinking more recently, because it's a skill that I think students could use not just in K-12, but in college, and certainly in the world of work, where more and more is project-based. I mean, if you go to a job, you're often on a team doing a project. And there's this thing about the gig economy nowadays, where more and more people are doing a series of projects for different employers. So project management skills, which are not taught traditionally very well in traditional teaching, but in a project where kids have to sort of think about, okay, what's step one, step two, step three? How am I going to check my work, get feedback, improve its quality? What do I need to do by the end of week one, week two? What are my resources? What's my assessment criteria? All these sort of factors you use in a real world job to manage a project. If you can teach kids that in school, I mean, what a gift to them.
Absolutely. I was also happened across, I think it's something you wrote just recently entitled How to Prepare Students for PBL. And this might just because I'm, still kind of in the beginning stages of this journey, but when I'm getting ready for a project-based learning experience, my mindset's kind of really focused on the curriculum and myself as a teacher, because it's still not comfortable for me. And so when I read that article, it was like, oh yeah, we have to prepare the students too, duh. So I'm wondering if you could just give us the highlights on how should teachers be thinking about student preparation before they launch maybe their first PBL so it goes well.
Right, before you launch your first PBL unit, and by the way, we're saying PBL unit these days, or project, not their first PBL, because it's
oh, gotcha.
Sort of a digression here.
No, I'm glad. No, please do. I get sloppy with my words.
No, you're not alone. It became a thing in the last 5 years, where I keep seeing people refer to, oh, I did this PBL on Civil War last month, or we're doing a PBL next week about our local water pollution issues. And as an old English teacher, it just sort of bugs me to hear a PBL. So I actually wrote a blog about that, which you can find on our site. But that's a digression. That's just me being the cranky old English teacher here. Although I do sometimes wonder if people are saying it as a way to sort of check off, we've done the project, we've done our PBL this year, now we can move on back to our traditional.
Oh, I definitely think that's part of it for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a worry we have sometimes. So, but anyway, for preparing students for project-based learning, yes, you can do it different ways, which I mentioned in my blog. You could spend some time actually talking about project-based learning and having kids think, you talk about what it means to learn in a different way, and maybe they have to vent a little about projects that they've done in the past that weren't so good and why, and how it's going to be different this time. So you could do that, or you could just launch the year with a mini project and then have students step back and reflect on what that was like, and then draw out the features of good project-based learning. So a mini project could be just 2 or 3 or 4 days long. It should be highly engaging, and maybe you don't have kids work in teams, because that's a whole nother hurdle. You might have to build their skills and collaboration before you do that. Maybe have kids do it, like, for example, just one teacher I know, Brandon Cohen, has kids create a slick infographic using some tech tools about themselves. And they get feedback from each other. And at a certain point, they still follow the basic elements of project-based learning, but not to a full extent. And they're practicing the elements of a good project by doing this mini project. So there are also lots of things you could show students. I mean, you could show students videos about project-based learning, have them read short things about PBL, as for older students. For younger ones, you probably just want to just jump right into a good project. And as I said, make them, the first couple of ones, engaging, highly engaging, and not too complicated. So don't start the year with a big 6-week project with, you got to work in teams the entire time, and you've got to connect to 6 different community organizations, and you're doing a public presentation at the local community college. Don't make it too ambitious the first project of the year, unless you're a veteran PBL teacher and that's how you roll, that's fine. But when you're first starting out, start with smaller, simpler projects. And it's also good, I think, to build students' skills. Like some people I know, they don't do the first project for about a month. They spend a month building certain skills. And even on day one, you might have students think about asking questions. How do you ask good questions? Do a question generation activity about any old topic or various topics. Or you could have students learn to give feedback to each other and practice critique protocols, which you're later going to use in the project. Or have them practice working in teams on short, sort of fun activities, team builders, and think about what it means to be a good team member. And maybe construct a collaboration rubric together and understand what that means. Practice things like doing research and knowing how to find good sources and knowing what's a bad source, or how to make a presentation, how to use certain tech tools that might become up. So you sort of build put these building blocks in place before you launch the first project. Because if you try to do all that during the first project, it might blow up in your face. You got too many things for students to try and learn at once in the project, not to mention the content. The collaboration skills piece especially can be very tricky. Even veteran PBL teachers still say they struggle with managing student teams, because some students just don't want to do it. They aren't used to it. Some of the high performers don't want to do it. There's a lot of issues around working in teams that students have. So that's a whole nother topic we could get into if you want, but building some of those collaboration skills before you launch the first project might be a good idea.
Yeah, no, please do. What do we need to know about fostering collaborative teams, and what are the major pitfalls?
Yeah, collaboration can be a pitfall because some students might not be used to it all. If students are brand new to PBL, they might only think of group work in the past that was not good, where maybe they did all the work for their team. There were a lot of freeloaders. Or maybe they were the freeloader and they said, oh, okay, I'll just be a freeloader again. They don't know how to divide the work up. They don't know how to hold each other accountable. They just think it's about divide and conquer. You do step 1 of this report, I'll do step 2, you do step 3, and we'll put it together at the end. That's our product. So they aren't truly collaborating. They're just sort of cooperating, I guess, to create this product. So teaching kids what real collaboration is. You think about the real world, a healthy team in a workplace. What do they do? So you gotta teach kids things like how to resolve conflicts. If there's a conflict on your team, you often have teams write a contract for how we're going to act together, or create norms for themselves, and have check-ins often and reflect on how they're doing in terms of their norms and their team agreements. They might have, and there's also issues around, like I said, one student doing too much work. So there you got to make sure you don't give group grades. That's a big pitfall where it's all one big grade for the project and you're all given the same grade on your team. And the teacher really doesn't know if one kid did all the work or not. And that's a real common pitfall. So teachers need to figure out ways, and we help them do this in our workshops and our materials, ways to make sure that the task is truly being shared by all the students on the team, ways to figure out what each student did during the project. So frequent observations, check-ins with teams, self-report, peer report, teacher observation, all these things you can do to make sure that teams are functioning well and kids are contributing equally to a project. And make the grades based mostly on individual work, plenty of short assignments and individual assessments to determine grades, not one big group grade at the end. You could still grade perhaps the final product, or maybe the presentation the group does, but don't make that a huge percentage of the overall project grade. Some people I know even say don't grade the final product, because if it's a good project, they'll still be motivated to do it and do it at a high level of quality, because it's a public audience, they care about the project, they want to do it well. So the grade is not there for motivation. Just grade the other stuff during the project, but don't grade the big final thing, and trust it's going to be good because the kids want it to be good. So those are some of the issues around group work. I'm trying to think what else. Structuring the task is important sometimes. You make sure the task cannot be done just by dividing and conquering. You have to figure out ways where the task requires kids to talk to each other about what they're doing, to check in, to have critique protocols, feedback sessions. So you sort of build collaboration into the task of creating the product for the project. You don't just turn kids loose. That's another myth about PBL. You just turn kids loose for 3 weeks and see what they come up with at the end. You've got to be in there coaching collaboration, and building in scaffolding and checkpoints is really important in a project.
So I'm wondering, imagine a teacher who doesn't have access to PD on this topic. and who isn't surrounded by people implementing projects, what's the best kind of get started resource for that teacher to find?
Well, to get started, I would recommend. I wrote a couple of books about getting started with project-based learning, so of course I would say read a book. Yeah, there's one on our website. On our website called the PBL Starter Kit for middle school and high school teachers of any subject. So it's a basic, model for designing a project and managing it. And that's been recently revised. We have a second edition just came out last year. So the PBL Starter Kit's a good book for middle and high school. And then we have one that's very similar for K through 5 teachers called PBL in the elementary grades. And these are often bought, a whole faculty will get the book and have a book study and talk about what they're learning and actually use the book to plan a project. We have another one called PBL for 21st Century Success. It's a little more advanced practice for going more deeply into how you teach the 4 C's, those success skills in a project: collaboration, critical thinking, communication, and creativity. And our book last year, in 2015, with ASCD as a co-publisher, called Setting the Standard for Project-Based Learning. That's where we unveiled our model for gold standard PBL. There's a couple chapters there for designing and managing projects. And all these books have lots of examples of projects and tips from teachers. They're very practical, not theory-based books. And also there's some materials on our website. There's a section in our resources called Student Handouts that have some just downloadable handouts for students you can use during a project. We have examples of, we have a good planning form to help you sort of structure your project. And that's what we use in our workshop, but you could use that just on your own too. There's also some examples of filled out forms from various subjects and grade levels on our website you can download and take a look at. If you're not able to actually have us come to your school and do a workshop, you could also attend one of our events, which we do around the country several times a year. We have PBL World Conference in Napa every June, and these PBL institutes at different cities around the country, and there's one in Canada, there's one in Spain actually this year. So those institutes are basically our 3-day PBL 101 workshop with some guest speakers and other bells and whistles thrown in. But those institutes, if you can get to them, are fairly affordable, and they're in different regions around the United States. And a good workshop is a great way to sort of jumpstart your practice. But the books on our website can also get you started if you want to stay independent.
Yeah, thank you. I can personally attest. I've only explored, I think, one of those, and that was the PBL Starter Kit for middle school. And I can just personally attest, I felt as though even when I wasn't teaching through a project-based learning unit or something of the kind, I felt as though just the knowledge kind of improved my teaching practice across the board. So,
yeah, thank you. There's also a lot of books written by my colleague Susie Boss around project-based learning, and she and I co-authored a new book coming out in September with ASCD called Project-Based Teaching, which goes into detail about our project-based teaching practices from our gold standard model. And along with that book, we're coming out with a bunch of short videos about the project-based teaching practices. So Susie Boss has written several books. She's really a international expert on project-based learning. So I'd recommend any of her books on project-based learning also. She's also got some really good books and is a real expert on using technology in project-based learning. I should mention also, we created some videos recently that have just been uploaded last couple of months on our website, which sort of exemplify gold standard project-based learning. There are 6 videos, kindergarten, 3rd grade, 7th grade, and then 3 in high school in different subjects. And so those videos are good sort of introductions to a high quality project.
Thank you. And I'm increasingly mindful of our time now. I think with our setup time, I've stolen right over an hour now. But I want to give you the last word. If there's anything I haven't prompted that you think is really important to say, please let us know.
Project-based learning can be used with all students, and that means all ages of students too. I should make sure to make that point. It's not just older students. Some people think, oh, you can't do it with kindergartners. And that's not true. We've got lots of examples of K1, K2 projects, some on our website, some from our national faculty. So you can do it with younger students. It might need to be more carefully managed, and they might look a little different compared to a high school project, but they still have those essential elements in projects, even for the youngest students. I should also mention that school leaders need to help teachers by creating the conditions for project-based learning to work. So It's not just teachers on their own. They've really got to get help from school and district leaders to do things like I was talking about, to help think about the use of time in their school, to change schedules, to provide collaboration time and professional development, and think about their assessment systems, how those barriers can be removed for teachers, and pursue it over time. That's another thing I should say, that you can't just think that one workshop or 1 year's worth of PD is going to make PBL stick in your school. It's got to be pursued for 2 or 3 or even 4 years to really sink in. For teachers to get good enough at it, they feel comfortable and think of it as a regular way to teach, not just some add-on or something they're required to do by their principal, but to really make it, take root in a school and change the culture of the school, change the culture of classrooms, so kids know this is a PBL school. They go from teacher to teacher, and they're experiencing project-based learning. It's not just a surprise in a few teachers' classrooms across the school. So school leaders and teachers need to think about making PBL a serious effort. It can't just be a few classrooms. It has to be done over time well, so it spreads throughout a school.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for the work you guys are doing. I really genuinely think it's invaluable to the profession. So we really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Joe. I was glad to talk to you. And if anybody out there ever wants to contact me, please do.
And is there, beyond the website and blog, do you have a Twitter handle that people can follow, or anything of the kind?
Yeah, you could find me on Twitter at John L. BIE. That's often the way I hear about projects and ask people to write guest blog posts for us. So if anybody wants to write a guest blog post, I'm always open to hearing about that. And you can email me too at johnlarmer@bie.org.
Can you say that email one more time?
So you can email me at johnlarmer@bie.org.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John, for your time, and hope you have a great rest of your evening.
All right. You're welcome, Joe. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, you can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.